I'll keep an eye on the questions, and if there are any questions,
Yeah, you can ask. I'll at the end. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
You can start the recording at 10, inshallah.
Okay, so it's 11.
11,
right?
yeah, 11.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay.
Guys, are you coming in? Can you close the door? Thank you. What was your PVL case this week? Septic shock. Yeah, I see. Oh, good. So that was after some bacterial infection. Was it the road traffic accident one?
Yes, motorcycle.
Motorcycle accident, and then the wound got infected, and he got infection, and then he got DIC. Okay, so you already know most of the stuff that will be going through. Okay, let's start. Oh, I have to stand near to the mic.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So over here.
Okay. Yeah, I can take it off. Okay. Okay. So today's lecture is on shock. Okay. And
You have it over here. If it's not there, then you have to sign this one again. Okay.
so some of the concepts that we'll be discussing today, we have already probably covered in your PBL. Some of the concepts related to this is going to come next week. But I will still brief you on those concepts as part of this lecture. Traditionally, until last year, we were doing this lecture as the last lecture of my series. But this time we have preponed it by 2 lectures. So some of the concepts will not be here, but we will still discuss them briefly anyway. Okay. So why is it not working? Okay. So these are the objectives. We will be discussing the definition of shock, the different pathophysiological types of shock. We will be discussing SIRS or systemic inflammatory response syndrome, pathophysiology of septic shock, different stages of shock, morphological changes, and clinical manifestations of shock. And the last slide is a very briefly about treatment overview, which is not your topic at all. About 75% of the lecture is about septic shock. Okay, so we'll be discussing mostly the septic shock. That is our main focus of discussion today, inshallah. Now, the shock or its definition is basically it is cardiovascular collapse, and it is the final common pathway for a number of potentially lethal events, including after severe hemorrhage, trauma, burns, large myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, and sepsis. It is a condition of profound hemodynamic and metabolic disturbances with failure of the circulatory system to maintain adequate blood supply. And the key event that happens is it leads to end organ damage. So this is the key thing. It ultimately leads to end organ damage, and that is the reason because a number of organs. Do you know what end organs are? Can you give me some examples? Liver, kidney, brain, lungs, heart. Yes, good. So these are the end organs. If they get damaged, then ultimately the patient will die. Okay. Now there are 5 pathophysiological types of shock. The first one is cardiogenic shock, where the heart as a pump, it fails. Okay. So, and the second is hypovolemic shock. As the name indicates, the cardiogenic means the cause is heart. Hypovolemic means that there is decreased amount of volume, either due to blood loss or due to fluid loss. So you can think about diarrhea or vomiting. Okay, and these causes are coming in few minutes. Septic shock is secondary to systemic inflammatory response syndrome, happening secondary to an infection, and we will be discussing all of these in details, inshallah. And then there is anaphylactic shock, which is a type of which type? Type 1. Type 1 hypertension. And finally, we have neurogenic shock. So these are the 5 subtypes of shock: cardiogenic, hypovolemic, septic, neurogenic, and anaphylactic. So these are the 5 pathophysiological types of shock. Now, these are the certain examples a brief overview of the pathophysiology. In cardiogenic shock, which can happen secondary to a massive myocardial infarction or inflammation of the cardiomyocytes or cardiac tamponade or pulmonary embolism, Over here, the main cause is a myocardium pump failure. So the heart is not functioning as it should, and the main function of the heart is to pump blood, irrespective of what poetry says. Okay. Hypovolemic shock would happen secondary to hemorrhage, diarrhea, dehydration, or burns, and this is secondary to decreased volume, decreased blood volume. Okay. Septic shock is not due to myocardial pump failure or blood volume. It is due to vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. So this septic shock, anaphylactic and neurogenic, the common pathways is vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. Okay. For cardiogenic shock, the pathophysiology is failure of the myocardial pump. For hypovolemic shock, the pathophysiology is blood volume, whereas the septic shock, it is vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. These are the examples. You only need to remember myocardial infarction as an example of cardiogenic shock. The others are there as well. I've repeatedly told you it is secondary to failure of myocardial pump. Okay. Hypovolemic is secondary to massive diarrhea or vomiting or burns or trauma, and the mechanism is inadequate blood or plasma volume. Okay, easy enough. Septic shock is due to overwhelming microbial infections. It can be usually, in about 99% of the cases, it is bacterial. Sometimes it can be fungal. Nowadays, it is mostly okay. And it leads to peripheral vasodilation and pooling of blood. It leads to endothelial activation, leukocyte-induced damage, DIC, and activation of cytokine cascades. These are the mechanism, and we will be discussing each of these mechanisms in detail today. One by one, they will be discussed. How DIC is happening, how leukocyte induces damage, how cytokine cascades get activated, and how they cause damage. They will be discussed in detail through diagrams and discussion. Okay. So but this is in very, very brief, this is the basic mechanism of septic shock. So a summary of how the septic shock is happening, but how it actually happens, we'll be discussing it in a few minutes, inshallah. Okay. Then that leads to anaphylactic shock and neurogenic shock. Neurogenic shock usually happens in the setting of an anesthetic accident. Okay. Usually secondary to somebody receiving either more drug that they are supposed to get, or they get a spinal cord injury. In both of these circumstances, anesthetic accident or a spinal cord injury, there is loss of vascular tone, peripheral pooling of blood, and the patient collapses. Okay, so that's why we call it neurogenic shock. Why do we call it neurogenic shock? Because the basic mechanism is an injury to the spinal cord, either through the drugs or a direct injury. Okay, a common example is, number one, I will give you 3 examples of neurogenic shock so that you can understand it and remember. Number one, somebody's like, for example, going in on a motorbike and they suffer an injury to their spinal cord. That can lead to neurogenic shock. They can collapse, and that would be an example of neurogenic. Second, somebody is undergoing anesthesia and they are giving wrong dosage or higher dosage of anesthetic drugs, and that will lead to loss of vascular tone and neurogenic shock. The third one that you may have seen in your life or in movies or dramas, etc., is somebody is giving bad news and they suddenly collapses, right? That is an example of neurogenic shock. They have a sudden loss of vascular tone, peripheral pooling of blood, and that is the reason they collapses. So that is another example. Okay, anaphylactic shock can happen secondary to any drug that is either taken, usually not very common with oral drugs, it can happen, but usually common with parenteral drugs given either intramuscularly or IV. It can be anything. It can be secondary to a nut allergy. It can be secondary to anything that can start a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction. What is a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction? What happens? What? Histamine is released from where? And how do mast cells get activated? What? Immunoglobulin E, IgE. Yeah, it's an IgE mediated. So the antigen that is coming in, which is the foreign antigen, okay, it is going to excite and activate immunoglobulin E, and that will stimulate what? Mast cells and basophils, which will ultimately lead to the release of histamine, which will cause vasodilation, and that will lead to anaphylactic shock. So that's the mechanism. Moving on. Then only in hypovolemic shock, this is not very well accepted, but it is an emerging thing. It has been reported in literature in some of the published studies. There is something that we call shock index, and it is usually, we can use it in only hypovolemic shock, not in other kinds of shock, only in hypovolemic shock. We call it shock index, and it helps us in determining what kind of, how much is the patient in shock. And it is a ratio of the pulse rate to systolic blood pressure. Okay, so the normal systolic blood pressure is around 120, and the pulse rate normal is around 70 to 72 beats per minute, right? So if an index up to 5, it would indicate normal or less than 10% blood loss. If it is up to 1, it will indicate 20 to 30% blood loss and impending shock. And up to 1.5 would indicate 30 to 50% blood loss and manifest shock, that is, shock is happening. Let's do a quick example before we move on. Let's say somebody has a normal 120 mm of mercury of systolic blood pressure and 70 beats per minute. So what would their shock index be? Now, what would it be actually if you divide 120? Somebody take out their calculator. How much? 1.7. No. You are dividing something wrong. Are you dividing 120 by 70? Are you guessing or actually doing? 0.5. So it is up to 5. Okay, so it is normal. But let's bring down the systolic blood pressure to 70. And the pulse has now gone up because the systolic blood pressure has gone down. The pulse would go up, and let's say it is 90 or 100. How much would this be? Do it and tell me on a calculator. Okay. See this? Okay, so this means that the patient is above 1, and so the student is saying it is 1.4. So this would indicate that the patient has lost around 30 to 50% of their blood volume, and they are in hypovolemic shock. Do you understand this example? No? You're just dividing the systolic blood pressure with the pulse rate. And if the value is up to 1.5, above 1 and up to 1.5, that is between 1 and 1.5, that would indicate that the person has actually lost 30 to 50% of their blood volume. Of course, the history needs to be there of severe diarrhea, dysentery, something secondary to cholera, things like that, vomiting, okay, or burns. So this is a good way of calculating shock index in hypovolemic shock. Only in hypovolemic shock. It does not work in other kinds of shock. Understood? Moving on. Now there are some definitions that we need to discuss before we discuss the pathophysiology of sepsis. The first definition is infection. What is infection? It can be bacterial, it can be parasitic, it can be viral, it can be fungal. Yeah. It is an invasion of the microorganism of the tissues. So the microorganisms are invading the tissues. Tissue invasion by microorganisms is what we call an infection. Okay. Second definition is SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome. For this, we need to have 2 or more of these criteria. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 criteria or more. We need at least 2 or more for us to label a patient as having SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome. Why this happens, we'll be discussing later on. Right now, we are just discussing the definitions. Unless you understand the definitions, you will not be able to understand the pathophysiology. Okay, so right now it's just the definitions. We need 2 or more of these criteria to label a patient as having SIRS or systemic inflammatory response syndrome. What are these? Number 1, they need to have high temperature, more than 38 degrees centigrade. That's 1. But sometimes in later stages of shock, especially septic shock, they can have actually reduced temperature, cold clammy skin and reduced temperature. So if the temperature is high, more than 30, so if they are febrile and they are having fever of around 102 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees centigrade, plus they have an increased heart rate, plus they have increased respiratory rate, and they also have either or have high WBC count. The normal WBC count is from 4 to 11,000. The criteria for SIRS is it needs to be 12,000 or more. Okay, so the normal WBC count is from 4 to 11. The criteria for SIRS is it needs to be above 12,000. There are 2 ways to write it. It can be 12,000, it can be 12 into 10 is over 9 per liter. Both are the same thing. Or Once again, in some bacterial infections, especially like secondary to Salmonella typhi, or in later stages of sepsis, the patient can actually present with leukopenia or reduced white cell count. So if they have a white cell count of less than 4,000, then that would also fulfill a SIRS criteria. And finally, normally in blood, we do not see immature neutrophilic precursors. The immature neutrophilic precursors, if you remember from your HLS days, are known as band cells. Okay, band cells. So immature band forms are not usually seen in blood. They are hardly less than 1%. But if they are more than 10%, what is that indicating? It is indicating that there is an active infection going on in the blood, and the bone marrow is pushing out the immature forms of neutrophils into the blood. So the bone marrow is pushing out immature forms of neutrophils into the blood, and that's why we see band cells or stap cells or left shift neutrophils in blood. All three are the same thing. There is no difference between band cell, stap cell, or left shift neutrophil. They're all the same thing. But we are going to use the word band cell here because this is the criteria. Okay, so we need at least 2 out of these or more to label a patient as having a systemic inflammatory response syndrome. Once again, high temperature, high respiratory rate, high heart rate, higher WBC count, or leukopenia, or more than 10% band forms of left shift neutrophils or stap cells. Same thing. You understand why? Because there is an infection going on, and the bone marrow will increase the neutrophil count, and it will also push out, if it is severe enough, to push out immature forms of neutrophils in the blood. So you need at least 2 out of these criteria. Okay, so far so good. So if somebody presents to you with fever of 37.7 degrees centigrade, and their WBC count is 9,000, and their respiratory rate is 18, and their heart rate is 88, is this SIRS? No. Good. Okay. Let me give you another example. It's better when I give you an example, you'll be able. So the same patient 2 days later have a fever of 39 degrees centigrade, a heart rate of 100. Already we have SIRS, right? And then a WBC count of 16,000. Is this SIRS? Yes. Everybody agrees? Yes. Okay. Always remember to clinically interpret your data. So this is SIRS so far. So 2 definitions so far. We have discussed infection, which is tissue invasion by microorganisms, and we have discussed the criteria for SIRS. So far, so good? Any confusion? Moving on. Then comes sepsis. So what is sepsis? Sepsis is SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome, and a documented or suspected infection. And a documented infection. How do we know there is an infection? Either by a positive blood culture report, or a positive urine culture report, or a positive pus swab, wound swab. Anywhere we can isolate a bacteria from blood, sputum, urine, then we will say that this patient is in sepsis. So SIRS and what is added? A documented infection. Or if we can see pus coming out, let's say somebody is diabetic and they have a lesion on their lower limb, which is infected, and we can actually see pus coming out, then that would also fulfill the criteria of sepsis, provided they also have SIRS at the same time, meaning 2 out of or more criteria of what we already discussed. Understood? So the definition for sepsis is SIRS and a documented infection. Okay, what is sepsis? SIRS and a documented. So blood culture is positive, plus SIRS is there, sepsis. Urine culture is positive, plus SIRS is there, sepsis. Remember that. Okay, so if I give a clinical scenario, the one that I just discussed, and add the word that the urine culture isolated Klebsiella, would that be sepsis? Yes. Good. But if the urine culture said there was no growth, would that be sepsis? Oh, excellent. Unless we can see pus coming out of the urethra, then it would still be sepsis.
Doctor?
Hello.
Doctor?
Yes, yes.
Can I ask a question?
Okay, go ahead.
So we can have sepsis without SIRS?
How can you have sepsis without SIRS? No, it
Because we
says
don't have
systemic
criteria.
inflammatory response syndrome. And do you see this word "and" here, which is red, bold, and underlined? This doesn't say "or," it says "and."
Yeah.
You need SIRS plus a documented infection. You cannot have sepsis without SIRS. Does that answer your question?
So the bacteria will be one of the criteria that I count.
It
in
has
the
to.
bacterial
So we
culture.
need to isolate and document the type of infection that the patient is having. So let me give you another example. Patient presented with cough. Okay, are you listening?
Yes.
Okay, good. Patient presented with cough of a duration of, let's say, 3 days, plus a sputum which was yellowish green in color. Okay, let's say 35-year-old male. Okay, and we did a chest X-ray that showed consolidation on the left lobe of the lung. Okay, we did a sputum and a blood culture, and the blood culture isolated Streptococcus pneumoniae. Would this be sepsis? I'm not asking you guys. I'm asking the student online, guy.
I need other criteria.
Sorry?
I need more, يعني more
Yes,
signs.
you need SIRS criteria. You don't know about the fever yet. You don't know about the white cell count. You don't know about his respiratory rate. You don't know any of those. So if I had added in the scenario that the patient was having a fever of 39 degrees centigrade, of course you would expect that in pneumonia anyway, plus a WBC count of 16,000, would that make it sepsis?
Yeah,
Yes or
sure.
no?
Sure, yes.
What?
Yes.
Yes or no? Don't say I think so. Just tell me yes or no.
Yes, sure, yes.
The answer is yes. What about you guys? Yes or no?
Yes.
See, you need to be this empathetic. Is it emphatic? No, emphatic, not empathetic. Okay. So far, so good. Infection, SIRS, sepsis. 3 definitions are done. Okay, moving on. 4th definition. What is severe sepsis? It is SIRS plus a documented infection, meaning sepsis, and again the word is "and," which is red and underlined, not bold this time, probably 4. And at least one sign of organ hypoperfusion or organ dysfunction. The organs that we just discussed, some of you said brain, etc. These are the "and" organs. So if there is a sign of organ hypoperfusion or organ dysfunction, then that makes it severe sepsis. This is definition number 4. Okay, so we started with infection, we discussed SIRS, we came to sepsis, and now the patient, because you're not doing anything, your patient has gone into severe sepsis. Okay, and if you still fail to do anything, they will go into septic shock, which is the last definition. So what is severe sepsis? Severe sepsis is sepsis and just one, only one. There is no 2 here. See this? This is also very key. One sign of organ hypoperfusion. So any one of these signs of organ hypoperfusion would make the patient in severe sepsis. Severe sepsis. Okay, let's discuss these signs of organ perfusion. It can be areas of mottled skin. This is an example. The picture that you see is an area of mottled skin. Mottled skin means that these areas are not getting enough blood. This is a sign of hypoperfusion. Additionally, we will discuss it later, but I will tell you this right now. This can also be secondary to the release of the cytokines, which we'll be discussing, inshallah, and endothelial damage. Okay. Capillary refilling time becomes more than 3 seconds. Again, this is a sign of hypoperfusion. Normally, this is capillary refilling. You cannot see me. So if you press your finger here, nail, and release it, it immediately becomes. Can you turn on the camera for a minute? Oh, I can do it. Why am I asking you? Why am I so dependent? I can do it. Okay.
No problem. I'll point to it.
Yeah, guys, you can see me. Oh, I'm on camera.
Yeah.
I'm more of a radio personality. Anyway, so you do this. Can you see this? Okay, and you release it, and it immediately becomes pink again. Okay, but if it takes more than 3 seconds for the color to come back, what does that mean? Hypoperfusion. That is the keyword. Thank you. No need for a camera. Okay. Understood? So another. Okay, third one, if the urinary output falls below 0.5 milliliters per kilogram, that means that there is some renal damage that is going on. That means there is hypoperfusion in the kidneys. So the patient is becoming anuric. Okay, the patient is becoming anuric, meaning they are not able to maintain their urine output. Then they also, if there is any changes in mental status, things like delirium or the confusion, it actually starts from confusion and then goes on to delirium and then goes on to coma, or any abnormal changes in the EEG, then that would also be a sign of organ hyperperfusion, meaning not enough blood going to the brain. If the platelet count falls below 100,000, that is again a sign not of hyperperfusion but of DIC. Okay, and we will discuss DIC a little bit today and more in the fourth lecture, inshallah, but a little bit today, inshallah. Then there can be acute lung injury or acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's coming up. I will explain a little bit when it comes up. But for the time being, it basically means less oxygen, damage to the alveoli. For the time being, just remember damage to the alveoli. And finally, there can be cardiac dysfunction and the heart can lose its ability to pump blood because there is so much vasodilation and other damage that is going on. So if we see any of these things, in addition to SIRS and a documented infection, then the patient is in severe sepsis. Finally, the key word in septic shock is the word persistent. So if the patient has sepsis with hypotension, which is persistent, despite resuscitation with IV fluids, etc., then this is septic shock. Okay, so step by step. First thing was microinvasion by bacteria of the tissues. The tissue microinvasion by bacteria, that was infection. Followed by SIRS, 2 or more criteria. We discussed the criteria. Followed by sepsis. What was sepsis? SIRS plus a documented infection. Followed by severe sepsis, sepsis plus one sign of hyperperfusion in the end organs. Kidneys, heart, lungs, skin, bone marrow. Okay, and finally, if patient remains having low blood pressure despite us giving resuscitation with IV fluids or dopamine or dobutamine or things like that, if there is persistent hypoperfusion, the word keyword here is persistent, persist, okay, persistence, then the patient is in septic shock. This is the definition of septic shock. Did you guys discuss it in the same way in your PBL?
Yes.
Oh, good. Excellent. You already knew all of this. Okay. Moving on. What happened? Okay. So this is just the sepsis steps. SIRS would be fulfilling these criteria, 2 or more. Sepsis would be 2 SIRS plus confirmed infection or suspected very clear infection. Severe sepsis would be sepsis plus signs of end organ damage plus hypertension. Blood pressure will fall. And this blood pressure, if it still remains low, despite our resuscitation attempt, the keyword here is this word persistent, then we say that the patient is in septic shock. Will you remember it? Remember the keywords. Remember the word and remember the word persistent. Okay, moving on. Why? Because I'll be giving you clinical scenarios and you are supposed to tell me whether it is shock, severe shock, or septic shock. Oh, sorry, sepsis, severe sepsis, or septic shock. Okay, of course it will be. Okay, moving on. Now let's discuss septic shock in more detail. Usually it carries a mortality rate of around 20 to 50% in the ICUs, multiple factors which are responsible for that, mostly bacterial infection, nowadays viral infection, and patient's comorbidities. More than 200 deaths in USA and the incidence is rising. That was last year. This is last year's incidence. This year they have already lost 250, half a quarter of a million people due to something else. Okay. Number of patients with life supports, because of the number of patients who are immunocompromised, the cancer is increasing nowadays. There are more people, more patients who undergo chemotherapy or radiotherapy. They become more immunocompromised, and the chance of their getting nosocomial infections or infections secondary to immunocompression or suppression increases. Okay, so for that reason, septic shock is becoming more and more common. And nowadays, it is the gram-positive bacteria which are responsible for more patients going into septic shock, not just the gram-negative. Okay, so these are the causes of septic shock. It includes gram-positive bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, fungi, parasite, viruses. Yeah, again, this viruses, that was in the pre-COVID era. Nowadays, it is very, very high. But it will not remain so, inshallah. Hopefully, we are probably over the crest, and this knowledge will remain the same. So nowadays, there are 2 kinds of Staph aureus. So we call them MRSA, which is methicillin resistant Staph aureus, and methicillin susceptible Staph aureus. So Staph aureus combined that is MRSA and susceptible combined, is responsible for, you can see, up to 45 45 to 60% of the all infections leading to septic shock. In the gram-negative bacteria, it is E. coli and Pseudomonas and Klebsiella, which are approximately together responsible for anywhere from 30% of the total causes leading to septic shock. In fungi, if it is an immunocompromised host, the most common fungal infection is, do you know that? Candida albicans. Have you heard this, or you have not done fungi so far? No. Oh, okay, no problem. You will hear this. You cannot tell Dr. Atif or whoever is teaching you that you have not heard the word Candida albicans, because I just mentioned it to you guys. Okay. Moving on. Now, what is the pathogenesis of septic shock? Why does septic shock happen? It happens due to the release of tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1 and interleukin-6 and platelet activating factor. From where? Where do these cytokines coming from? Macrophages, endothelial cells. Anywhere else? Are you awake? At the very back, because your head is like this and I can't really see. Sorry? What? T cells. Do T cells release this? Has Dr. Garvin covered that? Are you sure it is released by T cells? Okay. Now, before we can come to these cytokines, by the way, these cytokines are already covered by Dr. Abrar in detail, but we will recover them. There is a concept of toll-like receptors. Remember where toll-like receptors was first, this concept was introduced to you? Where? Second lecture, Dr. Garvin. Okay, good. So you know about toll-like receptors. What are toll-like receptors? These are present on macrophages and also on lymphocytes, and they play a role in both acute and chronic inflammation. They are located on plasma membrane and endosome, and their function is that they recognize PAMs. And what is PAMs? It is pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So there are around 10 that have been recognized so far, the toll-like receptors. And one example is CD14, and this CD14 is present on the surface of the macrophages, and they recognize LPS or lipopolysaccharide. Okay, this lipopolysaccharide is an example of PAMP. It's an example of PAMP, right? And this is coming from gram-negative bacteria. Okay. Now, once this toll-like receptor gets activated, it will do a lot of things, and we will discuss these lot of things on the next couple of slides. Okay. So this is the basic mechanism. You need to understand that there are something known as toll-like receptors, and there is something from the bacteria known as pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or PAMs. I've given you one example of toll-like receptor, which is called CD14, and one example of PAMs, which is LPS coming from gram-negative bacteria. Did you say something? You said the same thing? Okay, good. Okay. So this is how it gets activated. It also through, and don't get worried about this picture, it's very simple. It may appear to be complicated, but it is very simple. Let's start with the bacteria. There are two kinds, gram-positive and gram-negative. Okay, gram-positive bacteria release certain proteins. Gram-negative bacteria also release certain proteins. We call them lipopolysaccharide. These proteins, they will come and attach to CD14. See this CD14? See the CD14? What is CD14? Toll-like receptor. It's a TLR, and it's an example. Now, through a series of complex intracellular signaling cascade, it will ultimately lead to the activation of NF-kappa B, okay, inside the macrophage. By the way, this blue thing is a macrophage, okay? So inside the macrophage, this NF-kappa B will get activated, and this will lead to the release of interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. So this is where it is coming from, and this is how it happens. And then this will lead to a lot of things. Also, the macrophage will release reactive oxygen and nitrogen species, which are necessary for the killing of the bacteria. Why is this happening? So that these gets released. Okay, so the macrophages, when they release this, they can kill the bacteria. But at the same time, they will also release interleukin-1, 6, and TNF alpha, and this is going to lead to a number of things, which we will discuss on the next slide. But so far, just to recap, what we have discussed is toll-like receptors, which are on the surface of the macrophages and other antigen-presenting cells, including the lymphocytes, and the bacteria, irrespective of whether they are gram-positive or gram-negative, release certain proteins. We have discussed just one protein, which is called as lipopolysaccharide, coming from gram, and that it attaches to CD14, which is an example of TLR or toll-like receptors, and through a series of complex signaling pathway, it leads to the activation of NF-kappa B, And this NF-kappa B, when it gets activated, it will do two things. It will lead to the release of interleukin-1/6 and TNF-alpha from the macrophages. And secondly, it will lead to the release of reactive oxygen species, which are necessary for the killing of the bacteria. This is what we have discussed, and I have repeated it at least a couple of times. Understood? Any confusion? Moving on. Okay, this is the most important slide of the whole lecture. Okay, because this explains the pathogenesis in detail. Some of these concepts you would know, some of them are coming next week, but we will still discuss all of them anyway, some in detail, some briefly. Okay? What are you watching? The same thing. Okay. Because you keep on looking there and here as if you are watching a movie which keeps on skipping and, oh, I also need to listen to the lecture. So remember the PAMs we just discussed? That comes in and leads to the CD14 release of the interleukin-1, etc. Now these cytokines, interleukin-1, interleukin-6 especially, and TNF-alpha, they lead to systemic effects, especially fever. Do you know how fever is caused? It was covered in detail by Dr. Abrar. Which prostaglandin? PGE? Oh, see, you guys know. And then what happens? Where this PGE2 goes? In the of the hypothalamus and changes the temperature set point. Okay, so that leads to fever. See, I told you, you will be knowing some concepts. Maybe you will be knowing all concepts. That would make my life really easy. Additionally, these PAMs, they activate the complement cascade. Have you done the complement cascade? Alhamdulillah. Okay. So just to recap, in the complement cascade, there are three different pathways. Without going into the details of these pathways, they all lead to the activation of C3b, and that leads to the formation of membrane attack complex, which is just C5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you need membrane attack complex for causing pores in the bacterial cell wall, right? That is my concept since my student days, honestly speaking, since the day I didn't have, okay, I will not go there. So this complement cascade, once it gets activated, it will lead to certain other things. It will lead to endothelial damage. See this endothelial damage. When the endothelium will get damaged, it will lead to the release of other cytokines, including interleukin-6, reactive oxygen species, and that is going to lead to vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. How do increased vascular permeability happens? How does increased vascular permeability happens? Yeah, how?
Parasites contraction.
Very good. So the parasites, so they are beneath the endothelial cells, they are parasites, and they will contract. When they contract, the endothelium will pull apart, and that will lead to increased vascular permeability. Also, there is direct endothelial damage, and when direct endothelial damage happens, it will lead to the release of which factor? Tissue factor. Okay. Now, I don't expect you to remember this. It's fine. I'm not like, but there is something known as coagulation cascade. And there were three arms in the coagulation cascade. One was the extrinsic pathway, one was the intrinsic pathway, and one was the common pathway. This much at least you should know. Okay, this is more of a recap. The extrinsic pathway got started when the tissue factor got released, usually secondary toward trauma. The intrinsic pathway started from factor 12. Very close. 12 is very close to 10. I will accept it. Factor 12. The another name for factor 12 is Hegeman factor. And this factor 12 gets active. It's right there in front of you. So these PAMs also activate factor 12. So if the factor 12 will get activated, the clotting cascade will start. So 12 will activate 11 and 9 and 8, and they will convert fibrinogen to fibrin. And that will lead to the formation of microthrombi all over the body. Millions and billions of microthrombi will form all over the body. Okay, why are they forming? Because the PAMs, the pathogen-associated molecular patterns like LPS, will directly activate Hegeman factor, which is just another name for factor 12. And factor 12, like I've told you, is the first step. The activation of factor 12 is the first step in the intrinsic clotting pathway, which will lead to the formation of fibrin clots. Okay, fibrin thrombi. Now these are microthrombi which are forming all over the body. See, microvascular thrombosis. And that is when this is happening, this is when we say that the patient is in DIC. Now let's talk about DIC very, very briefly, only based upon its name. DIC stands for disseminated. Disseminated means, what is the meaning of, it's an English word, come on. Disseminated means widespread, spread all over the body. Disseminated means it is happening, widespread means all over the body. So that's D. I stands for intravascular, meaning inside the vessels. Very good. So where is this thing happening? Where is this microthrombi formation happening? Inside the vessels. That's the second. And the C stands for coagulation or coagulopathy. Let's go with coagulation. And what does coagulation means? Microthrombi formation. Now this is a mixed syndrome because the patient will present with both bleeding and thrombosis. Okay, and you may be wondering why. And the answer to that is, once Hegeman factor or factor 12 gets activated, it will lead to microthrombi formation. Agreed? So when the microthrombi are being formed, how are they? They will consume platelets and clotting factors. Okay, so the level of platelets and clotting factors will go down because the bone marrow and the liver cannot keep up with the demand for platelets and clotting factors respectively. Understood? Now what will happen, because the platelets and the clotting factor level will go down, the patient can have bleeding. And why is the thrombosis happening? Because there is a lot of microvascular thrombosis happening because of the activation of factor 12. So that's why it leads to a mixed picture. The patient will have both bleeding and thrombosis, and that needs to be treated immediately with fresh frozen plasma, plus in some cases, depending upon the underlying cause, heparin injections or analog injections as well, inshallah, in the next lecture in further detail. But currently, what I've explained it to you is that this is the mechanism of septic shock leading to DIC. Now, when microthrombi will form in the tissue beds, it will lead to tissue ischemia. And if it leads to tissue ischemia, it can ultimately lead to adrenal insufficiency, compromising the blood supply of all the organs, not just the adrenals, the renal as well, leading to multi-organ failure. Okay, so far so good? Understood? They also release other cytokines, and that can lead to immunosuppression and secondary anti-inflammatory mediators. But so far, the most important things that you need to remember in the pathogenesis of septic shock is, number one, PAMS is going to activate complement that will lead to endothelial injury, and that will lead to release of cytokines leading to vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. Point number one. Point number two, the macrophages and neutrophils, they will release interleukin-1, 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha and other cytokines, and they will lead to systemic effects. Point number three, PAMS will lead to the release activation of factor 12, which will lead to the formation of microvascular thrombosis leading to DIC, tissue ischemia, and all of these things will ultimately lead to multi-organ failure. So this is the mechanism of septic shock, including DIC. Understood? Everybody? You at the end. I'm really worried about you guys. I should not be. I know you are very good students. Yes?
These microthrombi cannot be used to stop bleeding.
No. What do you mean use? How can we use it?
Like
It's a pathological process happening inside the body, secondary to a severe infection. Okay? So this is something that is causing the damage. We need to stop it and try to reverse it so that it doesn't happen. The only way to stop it is to treat the underlying cause. Whatever is causing this DIC needs to be treated. That's the first principle of treatment of septic shock and DIC. Treat the cause. Okay? They will be actually causing end organ damage. Okay? Moving on. Now, the dominant hemodynamic feature of severe septic shock is peripheral vascular failure with vasodilation, secondary to the release of all these cytokines that we just talked about. Maldistribution of regional blood flow, abnormalities in the microcirculation. So there are two kinds of capillaries: stop flow capillaries and no flow capillaries. Stop flow means that their flow is intermittent. Their microthrombi is there, but some flow is still happening. It happens sometimes, it doesn't happen sometimes. We call them stop flow. The other ones are no flow capillaries. They are totally obstructed. So if the capillaries are obstructed due to microthrombi formation, then that means no flow is happening, and that will lead to end organ damage. Now we are on end organ damage. We are actively trying to either kill the patient or make it reverse. Okay. Now increase capillary and of course increase capillary permeability with interstitial edema. The patient will present with pyrexia, which is just a fancy word for fever. Rigors means shivering. Okay. Nausea, vomiting, vasodilation, warm peripheries initially in the beginning. Bounding pulse means fast pulse. Hypotension, which is a sign of septic shock, and if it is persistent, especially if it is persistent. Other signs include jaundice because of liver damage, coma, and stupor, which is just another word for delirium because of the damage in the brain, bleeding due to coagulopathy from the vascular. So they can bleed from anywhere. They can bleed from ear, nose, mouth, from the GI tract, from the anus, and they can have petechial hemorrhages, the ones that I showed you yesterday. Okay, they can have rash and inflammation of the meninges. We call that meningism. And because of adrenal insufficiency, they can also develop hypoglycemia. Now, these clinical manifestation of shock, they happen in a sequential pattern. They do not happen all at the same time. So they actually, the sequential failure of vital organs occurs starting from the acute lung injury that progresses to acute respiratory distress syndrome. Okay. Then cardiovascular instability develops, followed by deteriorating renal function. So the kidney damage happens, later kidney injury, followed by gastrointestinal failure. And that is usually manifested by inability to tolerate anything via mouth plus GI bleeding. And so gastrointestinal hemorrhage may also occur. And finally, at the end, the CNS manifestations will happen, leading to impaired consciousness, delirium, coma, and finally death. Okay, so this happens. So starting from the lungs, moving on to heart, moving on to kidneys, then the GI, and then the brain, and then shock, and then death. Okay, this happens. Now, what are the 3 stages? There are 3 stages of shock. The first one is known as the compensated stage or the non-progressive stage. Okay, so what are the can you name some compensatory mechanisms, guys? Very good, excellent. Okay, so these are the compensatory mechanisms. So in the initial phases of shock, when the patient has not gone into septic shock, actually in the initial phases, this is still non-progressive, and these mechanisms, the baroreceptor reflex, release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, activation of the renin-angiotensin axis, release of the ADH, and generalized sympathetic stimulation, they will all of these are responsible in trying to maintain the blood pressure, normal blood pressure. They will try, okay? But if the bacteria are winning, the more and more damage is happening and the end organ damage is happening, then ultimately this will go into progressive shock, the second stage. And this is characterized by organ hypoperfusion. And this is the time where we can do something in the first stage and in the second stage, okay? Where we try to do fluid resuscitation, plasma, antibiotics, everything that we can do, we need to do at this stage. Fine. But ultimately, if end organ failure happens, then the patient enters into an irreversible stage of shock. And here we cannot do anything. Once this happens, short of a miracle, the patient will not survive. Okay. So these are the 3 stages: non-progressive, progressive, and irreversible. 2 minutes more. What are the morphological changes? The morphological changes in shock is secondary to hypoxic injury. Why? Because the capillaries are shutting down. Why? Because of the microthrombi formation. Okay. Now these hypoxic injuries secondary to microthrombi in any tissues in the brain. And of course, when we talk about morphological changes, we are seeing these changes at the time of after death, autopsy. These are autopsical changes. Okay. In brain, heart, lungs, kidneys, or GI tract. So in kidneys, there will be acute tubular necrosis. In lungs, there will be diffuse alveolar damage. And in skin, there will be petechial hemorrhages. So if we see these are the morphological changes secondary to microthrombi formation. Understood? I think we are done. Okay, this is the last slide. Regarding management of shock, we will not cover this slide in detail, just 2 or 3 points, only 2 or 3 points. Number 1, remember the ABC, airway, breathing, and circulation. We need to maintain airway, breathing, and circulation. What is important is we need to give them things that will expand their circulatory volume. We can use blood, we can use colloid, we can use crystalloids. Examples of colloids and crystalloids include albumin and something that we call Ringer's lactate solutions. These are IV solutions. We give them IV solutions to try to bring their volume up and try to bring their blood pressure up. We may need to give them ionotropic support that include drugs like dopamine, dopamine, epinephrine, things like that. And we can do other things as well. Of course, we need monitoring, need to treat complications. If there is DIC happening, we need to give them FFP, etc. Okay, and all these investigations needs to be done. The most important principle of management is treat the underlying cause. Whatever the cause that is leading to shock, whatever the type of shock it may be, the 5 types that we discussed, treat the cause. If it is due to hemorrhage, stop the hemorrhage. If it is due to bacteria, give them antibiotics. If it is due to anything else, treat the cause. That is the first thing. Then identify the source of infection by doing respective investigations that can include cultures, that can include X-rays, that can include CT or even MRI or ultrasound, whatever is required, so that it can guide your proper treatment protocols. That's it. Okay. Now, if there are any online questions, this is just a summary of what we have discussed. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Go ahead.
Yes, in the shopping test, in the example of 70 over 120, 70 beats per minute, and pressure is 120, the result is 0.58. This is more than.
No, but you are doing it wrong. You divide 120 by 70. Here, divide 120 by 70. What is the answer? I will do it for you. No, I'm sorry. It is the other way around. So 70 divided by 120. Okay, it's 0.5. So it is fine. An index of 0.5 indicates normal or 10% blood loss.
But it's 0.58, so
yeah, you can round it off to 0.5. Okay. Anything else? Anything else? Thank you very much, guys. You can stop the recording.
Thank you, sir.